if you could turn to page 20 in your brochure, you'll be able to read a short bio on Mr. Finizio. So may we request Mr. M.S. Krishnan, Senior Advocate, Director, NPAC, to hand over a memento to Mr. V. Niranjan, and Mr. G. Subramaniam to hand over a memento to Mr. Stephen P. Finizio, and Mr. R. Murari, Senior Advocate, hand over a memento to Mr. Baiju Vasani. So the format, once again, will be that the speakers will, once again, the chair, Mr. Stephen Finizio, will lead the panel. And after the three speeches, we'll take a few questions from the audience.
Good afternoon. Is this working? Yes? It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. We have the London panel here, so it's my great pleasure to lead the London. We can't hear. Better now? Yes. Okay. As I was saying, it's my great pleasure to be here again. This is always a fascinating and important conference, and we represent, I think, on this panel, the London contingent. So I think for all of us, I can say thank you. Our topics are a variety of issues relating to choice of law. And what I thought I would do is start with some general observations about choice of law, and then turn over to Baiju and Niranjan to talk specifically about the topics that they've been asked to address. And then we'll end with some comments. So I want to talk a little bit about the parties' selection of substantive choice of law for their underlying contract, but I also want to make some comments about choice of law for arbitration agreements themselves. And I think some of this will be familiar. I just want to set the scene for issues of choice of law in contracts. It's an area we actually don't talk about as much as some other areas in international arbitration. So I thought it was worth going back and starting to talk a little bit about some first principles and what happens in practice. I think we can start with the basic proposition that arbitral tribunals generally have broad authority to select the applicable substantive law that will apply to a dispute. This comes generally from national arbitration laws, and almost all international arbitration rules will give tribunals broad discretion. And when tribunals make a decision about the choice of law that will apply to the dispute in front of them, those decisions are generally subject to very minimal judicial review. So I think we start with this basic proposition that tribunals, when given the responsibility because parties fail to select the choice of law, have wide discretion, and generally those decisions are given very minimal scrutiny. And you can see that in most international arbitration rules. There are generally three separate choice of law questions when we're thinking about international contracts. Those are what law governs the underlying contract, what law governs the separate and separable arbitration agreement, and is there a separate law potentially governing the arbitral proceedings? And I think most people should be familiar with that. Those three laws can be different, which of course can also cause lots of problems, and one of the things we'll talk about today. I am going to focus for the most part on the issue of what parties do when they select the substantive law. And just as general background, we know from statistics from various arbitration institutions that at least when parties are picking major arbitration institutions, they are usually also picking the governing law. So if you look at, for example, ICC statistics, when parties choose ICC arbitration, they almost always include a choice of law clause to govern their contract. And they also almost always, 99% of the time, will choose a national law and not some other type of rule of law like Lex Mercatoria or general principles of international law. Parties, when they're thinking about it and are sophisticated enough, they will choose a governing law. And in the ICC statistics, which will give you a more global perspective, what parties choose when they choose national law is they choose first English law, but that's in like 15% of the cases. The second most popular choice is US law, then Swiss law, then German law, and then French law. But that also reflects the parties that are using ICC arbitration. If you shift to SIAC, the statistics show that when parties are choosing, they choose first Singapore law, and that's like 60% of the cases. Then the next most popular choice with SIAC is English law, 21% of the cases. Indian law is next, and then there's a wide variety of other laws. So this is what parties are doing in practice. What they don't do in practice, and this is relevant to what we'll talk about later, is parties very seldom expressly select the law that governs the arbitration agreement. So they pick the law governing the contract, they don't pick the law governing the arbitration agreement, and very few institutional rules will ask or suggest the parties do so. The exception being the Hong Kong rules, which do in the model clause prompt the parties to pick a law, specifically say what law governs the arbitration agreement. So when we talk later on about choice of law governing arbitration agreement, one of the things we need to take into account is that sophisticated parties are generally picking the law governing their contract or the dispute. They're not specifying, and I think it's probably fair to say not thinking about whether a different law might apply to their arbitration agreement itself. And when you get to that question, what law applies to the arbitration agreement, various commentators have identified something like between 9 and 13 different approaches that have been taken in practice to trying to figure out what law applies to an arbitration agreement. And we can leave that discussion for later. But one of the things that the diversity of approaches means is that we're creating uncertainty and potentially unnecessary expense and distraction in enforcing arbitration agreements when there is that much uncertainty about what law might apply to an arbitration agreement. Let me switch gears really quickly to talk a bit about when parties are actually choosing the substantive law. So moving away from the law governing the arbitration agreement back to the question of parties simply choosing the law that applies to the substance of their contract. In that context, we still have to deal with at least 3 significant issues. One is that choice of law valid and enforceable? If it is, are there exceptions nonetheless? And I won't talk about this, but then how is that choice of law choice they've made interpreted? What is their agreement on choice of law? How is that put into practice? As just in terms of starting principles, when parties choose an international, and again, relevant to what we're talking about today, but in international agreements, when parties choose a choice of law, presumptively that parties have a freedom to do so. And then you see that in international conventions, you see that in most national laws, particularly sophisticated international arbitration laws, and in all institutional rules, they support the notion of party autonomy to choose any substantive law they want to govern their dispute. And again, relevant to what we talk about later on, some of the major arbitration jurisdictions will also expressly make clear that in a domestic dispute, parties are also free to choose any law to apply to their contracts. You see that, for example, in Singapore, England, Hong Kong, and it's maybe not coincidental that the places that are express about saying that even in the domestic context, parties can choose any law to govern their contract are also places that are very eager to develop the business of being arbitration centers. So I think that probably goes hand in hand. When we do see countries that do not give parties full freedom to choose the law governing their contract, it tends to be countries that don't have a developed market economy or a history of market economy. And in those few exceptions, we see countries that will apply a mandatory choice of law rule to the question of what law governs the contract, regardless of what parties choose. But as I said, when we get to more sophisticated jurisdictions and to institutional rules, party autonomy is the rule. Now, this is express choice. What most legal systems will recognize And where we start to get more interesting questions is the idea of an implicit or tacit choice of governing law to govern a contract. And that arises, for example, with the recurring question of where the parties have failed to expressly say what law governs their contract, does the choice of the seat of arbitration, is often the way this comes up, does the choice of the seat of arbitration show an implicit or tacit agreement that the governing law to govern the dispute will be the law of the place of arbitration? And that was the historic approach, although as the law has developed, more recent authority suggests that the selection of the arbitral seat is not necessarily a choice, either as to what conflict of rules laws apply or the substantive law of the dispute. That said, there are still many cases out there where the assumption is if you chose a seat, you failed to choose expressly a law to govern the dispute. If you choose the seat, you have been presumed to have chosen the law of that seat to govern your contract, or at least the conflict of law rules that come from that seat. More recent cases will say sometimes, I think rightly, that you need to look at the entire context. If you're going to try to find an implicit choice of of law, you have to look at the entire context, including the nature of the transaction, the language of the contract, choice of arbitral institution, and you shouldn't just focus on the choice of seat. But choice of seat still has a strong effect on the decisions about a tacit or implicit choice of law. As with any other contract, the validity of a choice of law agreement obviously may also be challenged for defects in formation, misrepresentation, duress, unconscionability, mistake, these sorts of things. So even where parties do expressly choose the law, we do have to run through the analysis of whether or not that agreement is a valid agreement. We also see occasionally parties arguing that even where there has been an express choice of law, that choice of law should not be respected because it violates public policy, but as I said before, or because there has been some defect in the formation of the agreement itself, or in some cases, parties will argue that the chosen law lacked a reasonable relationship to the party's transaction. The law itself is defective, it's not complete, the choice was not explicit enough, the choice of law was so surprising given the nature of the parties and the nature of the contract that it shouldn't be respected, or the law itself chosen is somehow unfair or unconscionable. For the most part, though, tribunals reject these sorts of arguments. And when you find cases where courts or tribunals have accepted those sorts of agreements, they tend to be very dated cases. There's a lot of English law from the 50s, for example, where you can see references to Arab laws and English courts saying there's something incomplete or improper. So the modern notion is choice of law is choice of law, and we respect it. And if parties try to argue that there's a public policy problem with a choice of law, the approach has been that a very restrictive view of this unruly horse is taken in terms of choice of law questions, and that the question then comes up, does a tribunal have to respect the mandatory law either in the place of arbitration or the place chosen by the parties to govern the contract, or potentially in a third country which has some relationship to the party or the contract? And the general approach has been, the more modern approach has been to say, at a minimum, that the arbitrators are empowered to address all those public policy questions, and that you can't excuse the arbitrator from considering those public policy issues merely because the parties have picked a particular choice of law. I want to end in a second with just one last quick discussion of what parties are doing in practice, and that is in contracts. We talked a bit about cut and paste. Well, where parties don't tend to cut and paste is when they get creative about departing from a simple choice of governing law where they choose one express governing law. And we see modified or bespoke forms of choice of law agreements that include things like dual choices of law, split choices of law, floating choice of law, I think in a different context, and we'll talk about it in a minute, and then choosing non-national rules of law. And I just want to quickly introduce what those approaches are. So a dual choice of law is where parties sometimes conclude a choice of law agreement that selects the laws of two or more states to govern the same contractual provisions. So they may say both English and French law. For example, there's a famous example of the Channel Tunnel contracts where they pick both English and French law, and they also refer to general principles of international law to make it even more complicated. There is also the option of doing a split choice of law, which is where parties will apply different national laws to different aspects of the contract. Both are generally perceived as being permissible and enforceable in most jurisdictions. They do create a mess, though. So there is a tension between doing that, which is often a matter of compromise and commercial negotiations, with the notion of certainty and familiarity and predictability that we want when we're doing international arbitration and when we're trying to reach something that it works in practice. So while those are enforced, they create problems. A floating choice of law provision is one that will apply, for example, depending on timing, depending on which party brings claims. So the contract might say, the choice of law provision might say, if party A brings claims, then this law applies if party B brings claims. And arguably some courts have been more skeptical about these, and arguably these are a bit at war with the notion of what we're trying to accomplish in international arbitration, because in some ways the objective is to discourage claims. And the idea is if we have this floating choice, it's going to lead the other side perhaps to be afraid of entering into disputes. But the problem is, what we end up with is the worst of all possible worlds, and truly something that's in tension with the notion of predictability, efficiency, neutrality, and familiarity that we want when we enter into international arbitration. So these are even more problematic